Welcome to our collaborative EHA New Zealand webinar to celebrate World Safety Day. My name's Philip Swain. I'm the National President of EHA. As I'm sure you're aware, World Food Safety Day was on the 7th of June earlier this month. But food safety isn't something that should be discussed on a single day. And now I'd like to also welcome Tanya Morrison, who's the President of the New Zealand Institute of Environmental Health.
Thanks so much, Phil. That's all good. The part of a collaboration is definitely working together. So between the two of us, we'll have you guys covered, don't worry. So good afternoon from the New Zealand side of things. I'm aware that it's morning in Australia, wherever you may be, an afternoon here for us in Aotearoa. Great to have everyone here today, and I mirror what Phil said in terms of welcoming everyone for today's webinar, celebrating World Food Safety Day. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker this afternoon, who is Nicola King. Nicola has been with ESR, or the Institute for Environmental Science and Research, for nearly about 18 years, which is a great effort, working specifically in the areas of food safety and risk assessment. Nicola's worked on a range of different projects, including for the Ministry for Primary Industries here in New Zealand and New Zealand Food Safety and Research, Food Safety Science and Research Centre. In her presentation today, Nicola is going to be touching upon the theme for World Food Safety Day, which was indeed that food standards save lives, and the role of risk assessment within the food standards. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome in, say good afternoon to Nicola. Thank you for joining us.
Good, thank you, Tanya. Tēnā koutou katoa no Aotearoa. Ka mihi au kia koutou katoa ke ahite rerea no Waikato ahau, e mahi ana hau ki te Institute of Environmental Science and Research. He kai pūtai au haumaru kai ahau ko Nicola King, toku ingoa, kia whakapai ake e te haumaru kai. Kia ora, thank you for listening. So I'm part of a small group of scientists who work in food safety at ESR, and ESR is a research institute, and we conduct a lot of environmental health science, public health science, and forensic science. So those of us working in food safety do a lot of our work with industry and government through the New Zealand Food Safety Science and Research Centre, and their symposium is next week if you happen to be in Dunedin. One of the projects I lead is this emerging risk identification system, where we look for emerging food safety risks and then support the food industry and government to respond from a research perspective. So my message, a quick little cheeky message at the start, is if you're out and about and you see any signals or see anything that could indicate an emerging food safety risk, please go to our website and let me know. Now, I've been asked to give a talk today linked to the theme of World Food Safety Day, which of course is food standards save lives. Now, in my role, I think about food standards in terms of limits and levels because my job is about risk assessment. So I think about how much of something should be allowed in a food or not. But as we know, food standards are more than just these quantitative measures. It encompasses protocols and processes. And just to get a bit of an idea of why these standards are important, I'm presenting to you some information here that was collated a few years ago by scientists who were brought together by the World Health Organization to get an estimate on the burden of foodborne illness. Now, they used data from 2010, and so I've got the numbers there below, and the UI stands for uncertainty interval. So it means we're 95% certain that these estimates sit between the two bounds. So when you start looking at that upper level, you're just shy of 1 billion people a year, or at least for that 2010 set of data, with illnesses and over 1 million deaths. So it's quite significant. Now, as part of that work, these folks also calculated these things called DALYs, or disability adjusted life years. Now, DALYs takes into account years of life lost because somebody has died from a foodborne disease, and also the number of years living with disability as a result of a foodborne infection. And they did this for 31 different foodborne hazards. And so I've got this graph here down the bottom, and it just shows what these estimated DALYs were related to different geographical regions. And the arrow there points to Western Pacific Region A, which is where New Zealand and Australia sit. And so there's kind of two things to notice here. The first thing, of course, is that we're down at that lower end. That's a good thing. And that's because we have a good food safety system operating in these countries. But of course, the other point to note is that, well, any colour appearing on this graph isn't really a good thing, because our jobs is to try and make that disappear whatsoever, because no one should really get sick from eating food. So you'll all be, of course, very on top of all of this, but just to sort of highlight that Codex Alimentaris is a joint effort between the FAO and the WHO, and together they prepare standards and guidelines and codes of practices and some levels, sometimes maximum levels for substances in food. And these are intended to be adopted as regulatory authorities around the world decide, and it creates a level playing field for everyone to draw from. And of course, here in New Zealand and Australia, we have our joint system brought together through the Food Standards Code and Trans-Tasman agreements. And then we have our regulatory authorities whose responsibility it is to enact those. So just with that wee foundation, I just want to talk for the next 15 minutes about three things. So I thought, what can I bring to this conversation about food standards save lives? Well, I thought I would talk about the role of risk assessment in food standards. And I thought I would highlight that with two quite recent examples. Some of you on this call might have actually even been involved in responses to both of these food safety issues as they emerged over recent years. So you probably know more than me. So first of all, let's talk about risk assessment. Now these 4 boxes, they look a bit like Monopoly cards. They set out the 4 basic elements of a risk assessment process. So the first part we do is think about the hazard, the thing that causes the illness. What is it? How might it get into the food? What does it do when it's on that food? How does it behave? Are there different types or different variations that are more virulent or more potent in some way? And then we characterize the kinds of things that happen when people ingest that hazard. So what is the nature of the health effects that this hazard causes? Is there some levels in the food that people need to ingest before they become ill? Has there been any cases where people have become ill from eating food that contains this hazard? And we also look at that other side, that exposure assessment. So this is about how much food people are actually eating, how often they are eating that food, how is the food prepared, because all of that affects the hazard and how that hazard eventually is presented to that person when they eat the food. And of course, what is the concentration or the prevalence of the hazard we're interested in that food? We bring all this information together to characterize the risk. And we might just do a qualitative assessment. We might just look at that information and make some discussion and some points about what we think it means and what it shows us in terms of risk. Or we might build a model that brings together quantitative data and actually produces an estimate of risk in terms of numbers. We might look at this in terms of a population. We might look at specific at-risk groups. We might look at worst case scenarios. Now, while I've outlined these 4 areas, the way that we undertake risk assessment, the kinds of information we use, the methods that we use depends ultimately on the actual risk question. What is the question we've actually got that we want to answer through risk assessment? And it might be that we're looking at the risks of a hazard in one food or a range of foods or the whole diet. We might be looking at the level of population or specific groups, as I indicated before. We might be looking at we might want to look at how that risk changes through the food chain, or we might just want to look at one part of the food chain to see if something will change if we change something. We might look at acute exposure, so when someone has a very quick response after eating that food, or we might want to look at what happens when people are exposed to a hazard in the food over a longer period of time. That's the chronic exposure. We might set up scenarios. So if we change this standard or introduce this new control, how would this change the risk? Or we might want to do something called risk ranking, where we start to compare different foods or different hazards in terms of the risk that they present to the public, because this helps us decide where we should prioritize. And I've got a dot at the bottom there because there's a lot of questions that can be asked. So in terms of where does risk assessment sit, You're probably quite familiar with this risk analysis framework. It's 3 basic elements. The science-based, the risk assessment part sits to one side, but it links strongly with communication and with risk management, which is the what do we do about it part. So let's go into a couple of examples just to highlight this risk assessment. So the first one I'm going to talk about is Salmonella enteritidis, and I'm choosing eggs as my food here. So I'm bringing a New Zealand perspective, knowing that things can be different in Australia. So this is just from this New Zealand perspective. So prior to 2019, the main serotype of Salmonella in New Zealand was Typhimurium. And then enteritidis was also quite common. But in terms of salmonellosis, people actually getting sick from Salmonella, foodborne transmission was from quite a range of foods. And I've just put some pictures here of tahini, because tahini and hummus obviously are recognised higher risk food, as well as sprouts. In terms of Salmonella and being caused through consuming eggs, we actually had a really low incidence of egg-associated cases and no strong epidemiological links between people becoming ill with Salmonella enteritidis and consuming egg or poultry products in New Zealand. And the final point there, enteritidis was not detected in New Zealand poultry through our national program that uses rinsates from poultry carcasses to just keep an eye on what's happening with Salmonella in the poultry industry. So what's changed? Well, during February and March in 2021, Salmonella enteritidis was first identified from a broiler carcass. So that was during this routine sampling that I talked about. When the whole genome sequencing was carried out, they found that the isolate actually clustered with a group of human cases of salmonellosis who were also infected with enteritidis. So there was genomic data to show that this particular strain from poultry was closely related to human illness. And just in case you're interested, it's sequence type 11, phage type 8. So investigations commenced and they looked at other strains and used whole genome sequencing, and they found that it was probably around a bit earlier and that there were other human cases linked to this, what we called our outbreak strain. And through this investigation, and I've included this link here because actually that contains a nice report that can give you further information. They found that cases of salmonellosis, there was strong epidemiological evidence to link them to eating poultry meat and eggs. So I'm just going to talk about the egg part, but you know, what happened next? Well, the next thing that happened was we had standards. And so an emergency control scheme was put in place, but this is only supposed to be a temporary piece of regulation. So that was later replaced by a revised animal products notice. And essentially what these require in terms of a longer term program is that any chicken producers involved in the commercial chicken supply now have to undertake surveillance for Salmonella enteritidis, and there are particular controls they need to put in place if it's found. And this applies right from the top, from the breeder farms through the hatcheries, rearers and layer farms. Now, clearly, there's lots more newspaper articles. These are just 3 I just pulled off the internet, and they show that this really had quite an impact. You know, there was a lot of testing, more testing after that, and then, you know, ultimately these kinds of headlines where there were financial losses and certainly personal impacts on those involved in those production facilities where enteritidis was found. The toll was quite high. So why the fuss? You know, why did we have to do this? What changed? Well, I mean, the short answer is that the presence of Salmonella enteritidis, this particular serotype in New Zealand poultry flocks, did increase the risk to consumers for becoming ill with salmonellosis from poultry products. So there needed to be a change because the risk increased. And so I'm going to just talk a little bit about the why. So Salmonella itself doesn't usually cause illness in chickens. It can in the young chicks, but in the adults, not usually. And it colonizes their gastrointestinal tract, and then it can be excreted with their feces. And because, you know, they're obviously flocks in close contact, it can spread between birds and you can end up with colonized flocks. Now, as a result of that, salmonella being shed into the environment is, of course, raises the opportunity for that salmonella to carry through onto the outside of the eggs, or I've also indicated here onto the outside of poultry, where it can go on to potentially cause human illness, either directly through consuming those foods or indirectly through cross-contamination, hands, foods, and also, of course, the environment. The difference is that Salmonella enteritidis can also colonize the reproductive tract of the hens. And this means that it can be transferred into the egg as the egg is forming. So those cells, those bacterial cells, can be inside the egg. Now, whereas Salmonella on the outside of an egg shell won't grow, it can survive on the outside, but it won't grow. On the inside of an egg, particularly if those cells are in the yolk, which is very nutritious, it can multiply. So this increases that risk further down. Now, the other really important thing to recognise is the way these poultry systems are set up. I mentioned these levels of grandparent farms or breeder farms and hatcheries, etc. So if you have got internal contamination of eggs, you then have the potential for that contamination to disseminate down through. The closer up towards the apex of that poultry supply chain an enteritidis contamination event occurs, the higher the risk of the enteritidis spreading through the flocks. So my second example is another bacteria called Vibrio, and in this case we're talking about shellfish as the food. Now, Vibrio is naturally found in water, so fresh water, but also seawater is the main place where people tend to become exposed to Vibrio. Now, Vibrio quite likes warm temperatures, although temperatures aren't the only driver. You do tend to see more Vibrio where there are warmer waters. There's quite a few species of Vibrio, but there's about 12 that are known to cause human disease. And just to note, excuse me, that they do cause things like ear infections and skin infections, as well as acute gastroenteritis. So quite a range of infections. They can be very mild. They can be incredibly serious. And of the three that I've listed below here, Vulnificus is one that fortunately we don't yet have a major issue with in New Zealand, but in other parts of the world they do. And this one indeed is one of the most serious. But I'm going to be talking about this one, Vibrio parahemolyticus, we'll just call it VP for now, because that's the one which has caused some issues recently here. So again, we have a bit of a pre-post story. So prior to 2019, we did have occasional outbreaks of VP infection, but those cases that either travelled overseas or they had consumed food that was privately imported, usually from warm Pacific Island regions. Then we had this series of outbreaks, 2019, 20 and 21. And this is the first time in New Zealand that cases had been associated with food consumed in New Zealand. And then a large long outbreak occurred between 2021 through to 2022. And this map on the right, which I know is very small, I just want you to see that distribution. What this is showing is the distribution of cases. And you can see they're right from the north to the south. So we all thought if there was going to be an outbreak, it's going to happen in Northland. Well, this proved us very wrong. Among all these cases, they reported consuming a range of seafood, not just shellfish, but shellfish was reported most often as having been consumed by cases. And since November, there are ongoing cases. And I've included this website because they keep this website relatively up to date. So if you're interested in knowing where things stand, then that's quite helpful. So we had these outbreaks and standards, out they came. So we've got to ask why. This is a regulated control scheme that was already in place. So this was updated in May 2022 and it came into force in June last year. And the new change to this regulated control scheme is that growers now have to consider the risk of there being cases of VP infection when people are consuming shellfish from that area raw. Now, if they think that there is a risk that that could occur, then they have to put in place a management plan. And obviously you don't have to read all this. I'm just giving the high level parts of the plan here to show you roughly what it's about. But essentially, in that plan, they are required to put things in place to prevent any Vibrio in the shellfish from growing after that shellfish is harvested. Now, there's no specific microbiological limits, so there's no limits to say shellfish must have no more than, I don't know, 10 to the 3 Vibrio in them or some such number. The closest we get is this little part here, which is just one option that growers can put in their plan, where they need to maintain control so that the level of Vibrio parahemolyticus doesn't exceed the average levels in the harvest water at the time of harvest by 0.75 log. So that's the closest that we get. And I just wondered, you know, perhaps people are asking, well, why don't we have a standard? Why don't we put in place a limit for the numbers of VP? And so I thought I'd bring you back to this 4-part of the risk assessment process and just give you an idea of why we just don't have enough information. So firstly, the first main complicating part is that only some Vibrio parahemolyticus strains have really been associated with human cases. We have some markers that can tell us what these strains are. And when we look in the environment, we find it's really hard to find them. We find the ones without these markers more often in the environment. So if you're going to put a limit on, where do you apply that limit? To all Vibrio or only to the ones that you think are going to make people sick? There's also these ones called pandemic strains. It's a poor use of the word pandemic, but essentially it's describing particular strains that will appear in an area, make their way around the world, and often become the dominant strain in human cases once they get to a region. And then I've mentioned, you know, these ones with these markers. Well, actually, we also find ones without the markers in cases of Vibrio parahemolyticus infection. And we're not sure if they may be dropping those markers in between the time that they infect someone and that person becomes ill and we get a test, etc., or whether they truly just don't have the markers. And so at the moment, we just don't have this magic marker, you know, indicator to tell us what will make you sick and what won't. When it comes to dose response, you know, this is affected by a lot of things, including the susceptibility of a host and the type of strain. And so it's quite hard to put some good numbers on this at the moment, particularly since there's some newer information that suggests that the number of cells required for someone to become ill might be a lot lower than we think. And on the exposure assessment side, you know, there's lots of unanswered questions and tricky parts, which you can get around, but it does make your estimates and your risk assessment a little bit weak. So, you know, when it comes to the number of Vibrio in shellfish, it's an environmental organism. It's quite happy in the environment, and it just gets taken up in the shellfish. And you could take 2 shellfish next to each other and test them, and they could have vastly different numbers of Vibrio. And they might have different numbers one day than they would to the next. So it's very hard to get some handle on what the levels might be at any one time. In terms of servings, some people might eat 1 shellfish, some people might eat a whole lot. And you might get around that by looking at those, you know, big people who do eat a lot, but then you also eat a variety of different shellfish. So where do you set your levels? Where do you make your decisions about what a serving size should look like? In terms of how that food's handled, Vibrio is killed by heat, so the more food's cooked, the less there's going to be. And I already mentioned that range of shellfish species. So, and on top of all this, of course, there is always the chance, even with good controls, that Vibrio can multiply in shellfish after harvesting. So if you had a standard, where might you apply it? So I thought I would just finish, jump completely out of that, just with this final thought for you. That while we've talked about how risk assessment underpins standards, risk assessment also underpins risk communication, which is that third part of the picture. And, you know, it underpins everything from this really generic safe food kind of messages, like this one from WHO, right through to more specific consumer group information, like this food safety and pregnancy document. So all of the consumer information that comes out is being thoughtfully put together using scientific information that's fed into and brought into that risk assessment process. So thank you very much, and I'd appreciate it if you have any questions.
Thanks very much, Nicola. In Australia, with eggs, I've had to introduce various restrictions on raw egg products and particularly in the restaurant industry. How do we balance that against the sort of surveillance for the types of things that you've been looking at?
Well, in terms of surveillance, it's not to do with egg testing. because you have to test an awful lot of eggs to actually know what your level of risk is. So the surveillance is very much targeted at that flock level. It's, do we have it in the flocks? Because if we have it in the flocks, that's where we need to place the controls. So I don't know if it really answers your question, just maybe repoints it.
No, that's good. Thank you. I think Tanya had a question also, so I'll hand over to Tanya.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, certainly, Nicola, I'm tempted, but I won't ask in terms of joking about, is this the reason why we have such an egg shortage in New Zealand at the moment, is this increase in testing?
Well, it's multiple reasons.
Yeah, exactly.
But not just that, yes.
More chocolate eggs around Easter time than there was actual eggs in the supermarkets in New Zealand, just for our Aussie audience. I was just curious to get your opinion, I guess, when you keep that risk assessment framework in mind. Standards are obviously a huge part of that, but I guess it's a question of, is the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff? So you identify a risk, do we immediately go, right, we need to put something in place to prevent this risk becoming an actual problem? Or do you wait to kind of see if the problem will eventuate, whereby, for example, you might have some cases of some incidents, which obviously isn't ideal to have, you know, the horse starting to bolt out of the gates and then trying to shut the gates very quickly. But what are your thoughts on the best way to approach it once a risk is identified? Do you be proactive, or do you wait and see if it's actually going to cause anything?
Oh, look, I think it's both, and I think we are doing both. In terms of the kinds of tasks or projects that I run here, they are a mixture. Some of them are ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. Some of them are, we've got a problem, we really need to get some risk assessment thinking on this real quick, so that we can respond, because we need to respond. But actually, probably the majority of the work we do is the beforehand. It's recognizing that there is a potential for something, or it's a food hazard combination that we've known about for a long time, and we just want to relook at that risk and make a decision about whether we need to do anything. So our role isn't actually to make those decisions. You know, that's New Zealand Food Safety's role. So our role is to just provide them with some independent science to say, here's what we think as independent scientists about where the risk lies and what the data is telling us and what the gaps are. And then it's New Zealand Food Safety's responsibility to then decide if they need to manage that or do some more research to fill those gaps so that they can respond better if the risk begins to emerge.
Cool. We've just had a couple of
Yes.
a couple of
You go,
questions
Tanya.
come in. Sorry, Phil. I might just do a couple of quick fire questions for you, Nicola, before we hand off to our next speaker. Has much research gone into the wet storage of oysters for longer periods, do you know?
I don't know where things are at in terms of wet storage. I do know that, and a lot of you on the call would know the regulations better than me. It was my understanding that certainly depuration wasn't allowed in New Zealand. That might have changed. The last time I looked at that was probably about 3 or 4 years ago. So you're not allowed to take oysters, or any shellfish out and then put them in another place in the water to depurate them. Now that might have changed. A lot of the research in terms of Vibrio parahemolyticus in New Zealand has actually been on mussels rather than oysters, because interestingly, while oysters are a big problem internationally, in New Zealand it was mussels that were causing the problems. And there's a number of reasons, and we're only speculating about that. It could be that, of course, we have bluff oysters are a biggie, and maybe Vibrio is not such a big deal in that area. It could be just an affordability thing. You know, it's actually cheaper per kilo to go in and buy some mussels than it is to buy red meat. So people are actually just eating more, that exposure is higher. And then you've got a lot of non-commercial harvesting that happens in New Zealand where people are just going out and collecting them. So now I need to return to your question. Has much research gone into wet storage of oysters for longer periods? I can't really answer that question. I think that's probably why I just did a big walk around the topic. So if anyone else is on
That's
the
okay. That's okay. We'll put that in the slightly too hard basket for Nicola to answer today. Another quick question there around what do you think around the impact of global warming on things like Vibrio?
Look, Vibrio is here. It always has been. We have been pushing for more work on Vibrio for years because we are seeing globally more cases of Vibrio and Vibrio cases in areas that traditionally there were none. So it's following the warming waters. Yes, so yes, in terms of global warming, it will impact what's happening here and in Australia, absolutely. And the other question around ciguatera fish poisoning, possibly, although that's more a post-harvest issue, isn't it? So talking a little bit on the edge of my knowledge, but from memory, that's a post-harvest issue when bacteria are allowed to multiply and produce that toxin. So yes, if we're not getting on top of managing post-harvest processes to ensure that stuff remains cold, then any bacterial outgrowth is going to be a problem.
We've got two more questions here, Nicola. We'll quickly fire those at you. What's your thoughts on the ongoing changes to the mass egg production away from the cage or battery hens, which is happening here in New Zealand? Is there an expectation, or has there been a reduction in the salmonella problem?
Time is going to tell on this one, because these new requirements for surveillance and response really only came in, was it from June last year? So time is going to tell. At the moment, it seems to be working. But that question around the production system is really interesting, because, you know, the whole caged flocks used to be a majority. Now I think it's down to about 10% in New Zealand. And when you look at the literature in terms of enteritidis, actually finding it's not great data, so don't read too much into it, but it almost suggests that birds who have free range have lower likelihood of enteritidis being the flocks. And it makes no sense, because free range means less biosecurity and less control. So it actually makes no sense. And it'll be really great to have more in-depth and really good studies on this. It might be to do with I don't know, the gut microflora. I have no idea. So can't really say if that production system is going to make a change, because it's all happened at the same time. I think in terms of going forward, the moment it's looking good, the problem will be is if enteritidis really starts becoming established, say in backyard flocks, which, as we know, are increasing in New Zealand because eggs are expensive and people are getting their own chooks. So, you know, you've got sort of ongoing stuff that are going to affect this as well. So it's a bit of a watch and wait situation.
Awesome. And we'll just take the one last question here, Nicola, quickly before we move to our next speaker. What's your thoughts? Is it possible symptoms from Vibrio can be missed from reporting, as GPs may treat for gastro and won't test or inquire further, so people may not seek help for the minor symptoms?
Absolutely. It's actually something we're trying to get funding to do at the moment, is to look at those barriers at primary care. No, absolutely. You know, there is obviously someone has to be sick enough to want to go to a doctor. Then they have to submit a fecal sample. And so there's already a first barrier. That sample gets tested by a laboratory. Nowadays, most fecal samples should be being tested for Vibrio parahemolyticus, but previously, historically, that wasn't the case. So when we're talking about this kind of increase in cases in 2019, some of that would also be to do with changes in clinical laboratories, and they've changed their methods, which means they're more likely to identify cases. So yes, multiple barriers which are in place.
Yeah, certainly we're no strangers to the multiple barriers in all walks of life. So, but look, really appreciate your time and joining us from our side of the ditch this afternoon, Nicola. Thank you so much for your presentation, and two excellent examples really of how food standards can indeed save lives and the role that they have to play in food safety. So thank you again on behalf of New Zealand and Australian institutes for joining us.
Thank you.
And thanks again, Nicola, from myself. Certainly sounds like there's ample opportunity for future research on these subjects. We'll head back across the Tasman to Australia. The first thing I'd like to do is to acknowledge the original inhabitants of all the lands we meet upon today. Myself here on Whadjuk country in Western Australia, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and those emerging. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Jim Dodds, who is going to be speaking about safe food and a bit of why food safety is important to local government EHOs, and how they're using the Sustainable Development Goals to show a connection to broader local government activity. Jim is currently CEO of Safe Food Production Queensland. He's a former Executive Director of Environmental Health here in Western Australia. He's had a long association with the environmental health industry, and particularly with the Australian Institute of Environmental Health, now known as Environmental Health Australia, and he's a life fellow of the organisation. Needless to say, he's well versed in food safety and standards. Welcome, Jim.
Thanks, Phil. I'd just like to acknowledge the terrible people whose land I'm meeting on this morning, their elders past, present and emerging. When I got asked to do this, I started to write it and I started to realise that in a process I've just been through in the food regulatory system, a lot of people see me as this old bloke, and I've sort of been thinking about it a little bit, and I tried to bring that a little bit as I thought through how I might do this presentation. This is a song that in my young youth, I stayed around a bit, and I think about it a bit, sort of life's in a meaning, and thinking back, and I've been trying to think about what some of this stuff means, not to the analytical depth that Nicola has just gone into, but certainly in terms of what does some of this stuff mean, and how do we actually get better bang for our buck out there on the street, and particularly for EHOs, and in my case, auditors, many of whom are EHOs, but not all. So just a little bit about Safe Food. We're a little statutory authority in Queensland. We're formed under an act. We stand apart from any government department. We answer directly to the minister. And we are focused only on the primary production processing aspects of food safety. We do get asked at times to assist in investigations and sometimes further work in other areas, but mostly we stay in that area. We do sometimes do some work in export too to support the Australian government. As I said, we're small. We're only 35 FTE and we turn over only about $6 million per annum. And most of that's self-funded. We raise most of that money through audit fees and other work we might do on a fee-for-service basis to sometimes help industry. One thing we do is take a real strong risk-based approach to our regulation implementation. It's not so much our regulation, we adopt the Australian standards, as Nicola's just done a fantastic presentation about how the binational system works there through the risk assessment process. But we actually try and take a strong risk assessment approach when we apply them, which means we're often taking that question that you had, Phil, about, I think it was yourself, about not being at the bottom of the hill, the evidence at the bottom of the hill. We try and look at, well, where is the risk and how can we resolve the risk rather than ending up at the bottom of the hill. I think one of the other things about Safe Food that stands us apart at the moment, though others are catching us, is we've got a real curiosity about the use of data to verify compliance. We've been working with the industry groups, particularly the poultry industry and the egg industry, but not only those, to identify how we could use data from existing monitoring systems they have in their schemes to verify, or in their operating systems rather than their schemes, to verify that there's compliance with our overall scheme, which is our regulatory approach. The other thing that we probably have that not all EHOs have the opportunity to do, though some do, we have a strong industry engagement ethos. So we have a really strong process of engaging with industry and sharing information about how we're seeing they're performing as an industry and show how that individual business might sit within that business. We strive for best practice. So we're continually trying to lift people or businesses above what the regulatory requirement is. And often we do that by trying to get them to improve their risk management approach rather than thinking about what they can do to get a better sample at the end. We try and talk to them about what they can do to better train their staff, to better manage their throughputs and how they operate, how their operating system works. And the other thing we've been doing a lot of lately in the national and binational scheme of Australia and New Zealand's been looking at this a little bit too, but Safe Food's probably a bit further down the path on it, is looking at some work that's coming out of the Prism Institute and Oxford University, which is outcome-based cooperative regulation. The UK regulators are using this a lot. And I know the Institute in the UK is actually looking at how this works in terms of primary, I think they call them a primary authority model in the UK, where local governments provide a whole bunch of services in this type of arrangement. So that's a little bit about us. We're a bit different. We do have a lot of EHOs on staff. I see Sue's on board at the moment. She's one of our EHOs. We have quite a few. I'm actually an EHO, as Rick said, and one of my senior directors is also an EHO. And then we have quite a few EHOs on our staff working as auditors, or as we call them, first officers, which are food incident response support team. So I tried to come at this differently. When you see someone who does such a wonderful job like Nicola did, and you're following them, you always feel a little bit sort of inferior. But I tried to come at this about where we're actually starting to position food safety and what it could mean for a local government EHO, as Phil said, but also thinking about how we do it. And I know New Zealand talks a little bit about where they are in the food safety in the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's probably a little bit of a reflection of where they are in the Pacific, because I do know a lot of the Pacific nations when I was there were actually starting to position and think about where they were, and they've got quite a movement around it. But we don't often think about it that much in Australia. So I've sort of tried to position a little bit of discussion just about around where we would land in there. The poverty one is really quite important. I've got a few notes down the side there about what it means, but there's a number of things when you're actually in a small Pacific nation which can have quite a big impact. The rejection of a market, if fish, or we just heard about oysters and shellfish, some of those things, if they were rejected for sale and the actual small Pacific nation was put off and not able to export for a while, the impacts into their community in terms of money available for actual food and poverty, all of those things would be fairly incredible. And you don't often think about that. And it does flow out in Australia. We've been dealing with a whole bunch of things at our level, which are emerging diseases of animals, the LSD, the lumpy skin disease, and foot and mouth disease and the like. If they were to come to Australia, the actual impact in terms of our rural and remote communities where Phil tends to spend his time would be incredible. There's a lot of work and a lot of money goes around in those businesses, and people would suddenly find they've got no income, they've got no work, and the impact to those communities would be phenomenal. So the actual food industry plays quite a big role in the overall Australia. It's when we were trying to come back out of COVID in Australia, most states noted that what they did with agriculture and then adding value to turn it into food was one of the possibilities for the Australian economy to grow back out of COVID. It was listed in every state as one of their real opportunities. And I think just in terms of one thing that plays out with us, and it always frustrated me on the ground as an EHO, was during COVID, we actually saw the situation where people realised that having a communicable disease or an infectious disease in your workforce was a real danger. So they paid people to stay away from work if they were sick. And the way that we pay a lot of our people in a lot of our food service industries, there's no reward to not come to work if you're not well, which obviously feeds into foodborne illness or potential foodborne illness. So some of those concepts have actually gone away. And it'd be really good if, rather than thinking about them just from COVID perspective, which was incredibly tense response across the world, but there's some reasons why those things are just really good public health and really good in terms of social determinants of health. The fact that if you're a low paid worker who's on a casual arrangement, that you could get paid if you didn't come to work because you were actually unwell and in a way that it would have impacted the food that you're producing. So I just think there's a few lessons in there we were going to carry on out of COVID that we haven't actually done so very well. The zero hunger one links pretty closely to this food safety one when you're in our neck of the woods. But the truth is that the discussion around poverty and food poverty in particular is actually pretty evident in Australia and New Zealand at the moment. I know particularly in Australia, as we've just come out of a budget and we're having all of the interest rate hikes, there's a lot of discussion about the inability to access food, and most of the people at a local government level would be aware of the difficulties that their food and general charity industries are actually having, and food plays quite a big role in it. So it's a pretty important aspect, and one we should actually not lose sight of. Food security is increasingly arising as something for the food regulatory system to think about how it can actually help in resolving this issue. When we went out for consultation in terms of a strategic plan for the food regulatory system, it arose as one of the real key issues that many of, particularly the public health and consumer agencies, raised, but it also came through from some of the industry representatives. That also happened in the Food Standards New Zealand Act, the FSANZ Act, as we call them. So it's an emerging issue. It's always been there. And I think the other thing that we talk about when we talk about zero hunger, and that is the chronic disease aspects of the food supply. We called it chronic food safety back in the early 2000s, that when you're actually in that hunger situation, a lot of the lower cost foods that we hear about, the junk foods, the super processed foods, the highly processed foods, are actually those foods that people that are hungry or have not a lot of money. But this is one where I think EHOs don't realise what they can add. As we've started to investigate further into the horticulture supply chain, I'm going to talk about that a little bit later in my presentation, but as we've started to work into the water and into the horticulture, the actual importance of clean water right the way through the production process has really become evident. And I'd just make the point that, and I know I'm speaking too long on many of these, but local government EHOs often oversight a lot of environmental water monitoring programs, which could inform the quality of water being used in agriculture. And sometimes in agriculture, it's being used for post-harvest operations. And there's plenty of packing sheds and the like we're starting to find that are on farm where they're using water. And straight after that water's been used, they end up in consumers, and consumers are treating those foods as ready to eat. So it's a pretty important aspect of water. And EHOs have got a lot of knowledge. And I know from my time in Western Australia, and Phil, we were starting to reach that point of looking at reuse of water. And in fact, we had approved the reuse of water. That was what the Environmental Health Directorate over there did do. We were the approver of that. And it's got to be fit for purpose. It's all right to think you can just use the water in that purpose, but what's its ultimate pathway? And we did a lot of risk assessment work around that and understanding that. So the clean water and sanitation, particularly for Australia, and from my time as chair of nHealth Council, I know the work that New Zealand was doing in that space. It's a pretty critical thing, and it's something where EHOs have got a really good opportunity to be a real clear leader in how we actually manage that and how we can reduce the impact and make sure what we're doing is reasonable. Look, this is one that's really just come onto my radar in the last, I suppose, 12 or 18 months. The food waste got talked about, and I guess to some degree I ignored it other than what I saw happened in my home. But then I started to pick up on what was happening with the regulatory environment in the UK, and it starts to, you start to understand why people are doing it. If you look at the numbers I put in that slide from UK, where they're saying that 6.4 million tonnes of food that was thrown away that could have been eaten. And they're basically saying that a very large proportion of that was because of the best before date. And there's a bit of debate emerging, I know, in New Zealand, and there's been some discussion, but not as informed in Australia as what there has been in New Zealand, about what the purpose of best before dates are and whether we could actually deal with them in a different way, shelf lives and the like. So it's something that's going to really start to come to the forefront for EHOs as you're starting to look in that retail sector. I'm not quite sure how we're going to manage it. There's a lot of talk about what we can do with waste that's thrown away when we're actually talking about our waste management systems that we bring to the household and at businesses and the like, so we can get them into a different pathway than landfill. But there's starting to be some discussion about what we can do in the food supply chain to make sure that some of that food doesn't find its pathway there because the use by date is different. So it's just one, and as I say, I've not been close enough to it, but I think it's going to play out really interestingly for us as people on the ground regulating, and particularly in the retail sector where there's a difference between a use by date and a best before date. And I think I myself have just confused those in that discussion, but it's that best before date that the UK government and some other European governments are actually looking at removing. And I think one European nation has already removed it. So it's just one to watch, which is a change in our thinking and how we're going to actually manage it. It's going to be a risk-based approach, but a pretty important one. And I think we need to think it through and be ready for it. Look, I just thought this one was worth having a look at because the World Health Organization reviewed their strategy for food safety last year. And when I read through it, I just thought when you look at some of the changes they're talking about, they actually put them into a framework that was worth being aware of as an EHO on the ground. They're certainly pretty important for us in terms of how we look at things because we spend a bit more time, I guess, in some more sophisticated manufacturing spaces. But if you think about the increased demand for food safety, there's a lot more consumer interest at the moment in relation to it. And that actually means there's more resources there. Well, the resources are usually promotional resources. They're not anything that in terms of additional EHOs on the ground to actually do the work. It's usually something that industry has produced or government has produced as information around consumers. The global food safety threats, I think that's been on the move in our neck of the woods for a while. We've been trying to uplift food acts across the nations, the two nations over the last few years. And I think New Zealand's just done an uplift. And I know that when I was in the Pacific, the Australian government and the New Zealand government were working with World Health to assist many of the Pacific nations to uplift their performance in that space. The global changes to the impacts on the food supply, those extended and complex global food supply chains, we're seeing some real impacts with sunflower oil being out of the marketplace with Ukraine, where people are having to substitute and make new recipes for some of their foods. But there's also a lot of things going on at the moment where there's actually a recall happened in the UK as a result of a product from Australia that was sent over as a seeding product for a yogurt and the like. So there's a lot of things happening there where something could emerge from your own neck of the woods, a small operator or a manufacturer, then all of a sudden it's having an impact somewhere else. Just as much as a few years ago, we had the hepatitis A with semi-dried tomatoes, which came into Australia via a whole bunch of long pathways. Society's changing. I don't think I need to go into that too much. We've changed requirements and we've changed desires. The next one that I think is probably pretty good is that rise of new technologies. We're really starting to see, and it doesn't get a whole lot of public knowledge other than a little bit of ABC News reporting and the like, but there's a real lot of effort in this precision fermentation, which is going to be producing foods that aren't from the animal or from the plant. And it sounds all pretty easy and all the rest of it, but the reality is if they're actually produced in that space, they're probably going to have a different microbiological risk to something that's grown out in the paddock and that. So will they be labelled differently? And consumers might confuse when they're eating something that's been grown out in the environment, which might have some still residual contamination, and as opposed to something that's been grown completely sterile, and particularly with some of the raw food consumption, the raw meats and that, all of a sudden we actually joke, but no, it's true that we could actually reach the point where raw chicken is not something that's a food safety risk if it's grown in one of those environments. And I think the demographic changes speak for themselves. So if we could just wanted to sort of talk about Campylobacter, and I acknowledge that that's not a Campylobacter, but it was a particular bacteria I could get that showed nicely. But there's a couple of things around that I think are worth local government EHOs being mindful of. It's mostly associated with chicken meat, and we generally go there, but it's not only associated there. There's lots on pigs, and in fact there's quite a bit on pets and in pet foods and the like. So there are things around there. We've put a lot of effort in Australia to trying to reduce the loads on the carcasses when they leave the farm, or on the birds when they leave the farms, and on the other animals when they arrive at the abattoir. So we're trying to actually reduce that load. And we've done a lot of work in the processing facilities to further reduce those loads as we go through. And I'll show you a slide in a minute that shows some of the numbers. In fact, we've got a standard in Australia, which came in the early 2000s, to actually drive the carcass rates down to 10,000. And in Queensland, we've been getting those down consistently around the 5,000 mark now for many, many years. So there's been a real lot of work to get that down. But the way we grow poultry in particular, and a little bit with some of the other species that are important in this disease, is different to how they grow them in Europe and North America. And the thing that you'll see when I show you the next slide is if you actually, you just need to have a look about what we can do in the home and food service. We've put a lot of effort in that other end. The green line is when we introduced the standard for Australia-wide, not New Zealand, to reduce the carcass load on the animals. And we set a standard through a risk assessment process. A standard was set, and we talked to industry and they could reach it. So we got that down, and we've consistently held it down. And we know at least 2 states have been able to hold that down. The blue line is the national line, the grey line is Queensland. So you can see nationally the trend is still going up, and in Queensland it's going up. The orange line was COVID, and we all know that we believe that improved hygiene in the home and the like impacted that, but we also know that probably people less turned up to get tested and the like as well. So there's no point. But the real point is that we've been able to reduce the load quite considerably on the incoming primary produce, but the numbers keep on going up. In fact, in Queensland, they're still going up, and nationally in Australia, they're still going up. And I think New Zealand drove them down for a while, but yours are still reasonably high. And what we are seeing is that there is still opportunity, well, we believe, or I believe, there's still opportunity in the home to actually think about how that bacteria gets spread around in the home. And we've seen all the things about don't wash your chickens and the likes of that. But it's actually about local government EHOs starting to get that message out more and more as a risk communication message. So there's the home and there's the food service industry, where much the same cross-contamination issues have that potential to occur. So regards to the work we do upstairs, sorry, someone's posted what you mean by carcass load. When we swab the carcasses, when they leave the abattoir, it's the amount of bacteria that is still on the carcass. So most meats and the like are presumed to go to consumption after further treatment, which is cooking in our home. So a heat treatment, which would kill the bacteria. But the problem is that whilst they're still raw, some of that bacteria is still on them. Campylobacter is incredibly infective, and taps and the like in homes are being considered as a considerable risk point, just like our cutting boards and the like, but they actually spread a lot further when people try and wash them in their sinks and do things like that. So it's a thing worth actually having a good think about. It's one of the most reported diseases from a foodborne illness perspective in Australia. So that's sort of the Campo one. As I said earlier, horticulture, the water is actually not the only thing, because we're starting to see some requests for organic horticulture and the like, which will obviously bring biosolids and that into the mix. But the food ministers, which are predominantly health ministers of Australia and New Zealand, came to the table, and they've done this a couple of times, and asked for FSANZ to do a risk assessment and see if a standard was needed to control the microbiological, particularly levels in horticulture, but not restricted to that. They did also consider chemical levels. And just recently, when they did do that, they went through a process of doing a new risk assessment, and the numbers were a bit surprising to most people. Like, there was only 10 confirmed outbreaks, but indeed there were 93 that were in some way associated between 2001 and 2011. And FSANZ consulted with stakeholders and others, and they started to read through it a lot, and they found that the poor use of quality of water, as I said, post-harvest and pre-harvest, there are some plants where that water that's not of good enough quality does get taken up into the structure of the plant. And we've looked at an outbreak recently where we think that one of the potential pathways was the taking of that water up into the actual plant itself. And as I recall, in a seed sprout when I was involved in Western Australia, that looked like the most likely pathway for that particular one too. So they found a number of things, but the other thing was that breaches of good hygiene practice along the supply chain. And that was not always on the farm. Sometimes it was as things happened when they got into retail and got into those marketplaces. So there was quite a few issues that they identified. And the end result of that consideration was they did a risk analysis, then they did a cost benefit analysis. And the end result was, yes, we can actually apply a standard. So, and they decided to actually only apply that standard to melons, berries, and leafy greens. The leafy greens are the things that you would buy in a pre-packed, ready-to-eat package in your supermarket and the like. And I guess that's where most of the focus is, but it's not restricted to that. It also covers leafy greens that might find their way into the supermarket as a whole lettuce or the like. The definition is a bit loose at the moment. There's some things that are in and some things that aren't in, and they've given some movement to the regulators to add to that list with their agreement over time. But there's two things that I think are important for local government EHOs in this space. As part of that process, because it was a really difficult discussion and a difficult consultation, there was agreement that we would start to look at how we could use industry schemes. So existing industry audit schemes, which verify compliance against industry standards, not a FSANZ standard. But if we could prove that there was equivalence, that we could get the same food safety outcome, and we could verify that scheme, we would consider it as a pathway of proving that you were verifying compliance. So it's a different approach. This is going to be looking at data and auditing systems that are operated and run by commercial entities which are owned by industry associations, for want of a better description. We've not settled on it. You've got to be honest. I know some people are saying it's a done deal. It's not. The regulators are still trying to figure out whether that will work and whether they can get an equivalence or compliance with what the standard requires for food safety. There's a bunch of other things in those standards that they measure, and we're only interested in food safety. So it's not done. But the reason I raise it is that in a number of states, that aspect of food safety does get delegated to local government EHOs. And again, that's going to be a really different way about how you think about doing your work. You probably might be asked to spot check some farms and audit a system to see what the auditors are doing. So you'd be auditing the auditor in effect, rather than actually operation. So it's a totally different way of thinking about it. And it's where safe food has been moving for a while. So it's a comfortable shift for us and for our EHOs and our other auditors, but it's going to be a significant shift for those of us that are in the regulation industry at the moment. I just threw this one up because we've been putting a lot of work up on our website and been looking at it, and declaration of, I suppose, conflict of interest. One of my staff is a really senior person, well acknowledged as a professional around the world in the allergen space. But when you actually look at the recalls for allergens, for foods in Australia and New Zealand, I think predominantly Australia, the data I've put up here, 44% of the recalls in the last few years have been related to allergens, and particularly dairy, I might add, which is actually finds its pathway through additives and things that are used in making the products. So I just wanted to raise the fact that in my experience in WA, this emerged a couple of times in food service, and it was really difficult for the community and for the local government EHO. In fact, after one coronial inquiry, I gave evidence at it, and the findings after what I thought was reasonable evidence, the findings afterwards, the coroner recommended that EHOs should get more training in understanding allergens, and particularly the contamination in the food service sector, and how to make sure that products that were labelled as not having nuts or something like that in them didn't have them. And it was really hard for people in remote areas to actually, if they were buying a pre-made cake or something, to actually get the recipe and confirm really clearly that that food did or did not have that particular allergen in it. So I know it's front of mind for a lot of people, but it's still an ongoing issue, and there's still lots and lots of recalls based around that. And it is an issue in food service, whether it's in a restaurant or a cafe or sometimes in a packaged food. The packaged food stuff is probably going to get tightened up a little bit more. That statement of catch-all, let's get out of jail, of may contain, there's a lot of effort going into that now to try and tighten that up and stop people just making that statement, because that's meaningless to someone who is actually got a serious allergen to that particular problem. Let's just, I forgot I had that one in there, but just sort of showing the number of the different allergen ones, and it's about labeling and packaging often, that there's the wrong information. As you can see, the largest one is actually about the actual work not being acknowledged, or the contamination not being acknowledged. I just threw this one in there because there's been a real lot of resources put together here, and they're all really useful for EHOs at that local government level, and useful just general references that you might want to have. So I'm not going to go into them, but I've just put them there as something that's useful. And I threw one in there, which I think is publicly available, which is a presentation from the Allergens Bureau of Australia recently, which went into some of the issues there. And I haven't thought it through as much, but we actually had one food product where our agricultural people were recommending that they grow peanuts as a rotational crop so that they could fix nitrogen into the soil. And that product that they were then going to grow on rotation back was going to find its way directly into the food supply chain. So there's a real possibility of peanut contamination as an allergen finding its way into what was an ingredient that found its way into a lot of foods. So there was real potential there. Would it have been realised? Who knows? But the risk way to deal with it was, don't introduce the risk into the supply chain. I've alluded to a lot of these things as I've gone through, but I just wanted to go back to them and just sweep them up a little bit. And that's just this issue of some of the things that are out there. And my reason for this is EHOs are often, in my opinion, on a lot of issues, not just food safety, they're often a really important risk communication person out there around public health risk. There's a lot of other people, but EHOs have a science approach to it, and they generally deal with risk in a more informed way than a lot of other people do. So they often play a role in some of these things. So I've deliberately put it in there. But look, the new technologies, and particularly as I've said, that precision fermentation with the lab-grown meats, not only are they starting to find their way out on the marketplace, but what we're noting from what we're seeing as investment information, and it's reasonably confidential, but a lot of that sort of work is not happening in Sydney and Brisbane, Perth. It's actually starting to happen out in the regional centres where that agricultural feedstock is. So there'll be manufacturing plants that possibly, depending on how food safety regulation is implemented in your state, a local government EHO would probably be asked to be the approval authority and the ongoing compliance and measuring authority to ensure that that food is safe. And it's going to be a fairly complex manufacturing process. We've got a whole team of food technologists doing research and working on it in a lab, trying to commercialise the stuff over in one of our universities here at the moment, part of our department. So it's a pretty important thing, and you kind of need to reach out to people like us should you get one of those dropped on your lap to try and understand what the risks might be and what's going on and how to manage them. The longer supply chains is big for a whole bunch of reasons. We have a lot of floods and disasters here in Queensland, and just recently one of those supply chains played out as one of the retail firms brought all of their meat processing together to one very large plant. We had a flood out there and we had trucks backed up with all of the meat to go into Queensland, northern New South Wales and into the Northern Territory. We couldn't supply it, but not only could we not supply it, but the meat that was packed into trucks, we had to verify how we could actually manage that temperature control and the like. So there's some really basic things that are going to play out for local government EHOs to think about in those longer supply chains, whether those products would have really been safe. And I saw a lot of those long supply chains in Western Australia. The new approaches to extending shelf lives, as I've said, there's a bit of a question about use by dates, but the things that are being used to extend those shelf lives, it's always been about radiation, like all of the debate. But some of the probiotics that are being used and being experimented with there, we've seen emerge as contaminants later on. They've not been of any great significance, but it's still worth being mindful that there's probably some things happening there that could play out for us. I wouldn't walk away from the outcome-based cooperative regulation. As I said, that's going to be a real game changer. That's where we would actually be starting to sit down, and we've got a standard set, and we would negotiate with industry about how you're going to demonstrate how you would comply with that standard. In the UK, my understanding is they could nominate that we want to go to local government X who are really well versed in this space, and they would do everything in that space. For argument's sake, in Queensland, Woolworths might go and say they would actually work with one particular local government and they would give them approval for everything they did in their shop across every site in Queensland. That's the type of model that's actually emerged in the UK. And I know the Chartered Institute have been pretty supportive of that for a whole bunch of reasons, because it's actually brought in a lot more than food safety. As I've said, the use of industry schemes to verify compliance, we've been doing that for a while at Safe Food, but it's going to be there. And the other one I'd really encourage you to start to embrace and look at is the use of digital approaches to verify compliance. So many of these manufacturing situations have lots and lots of data on different points of their production, but being able to understand their system is the thing, not being able to understand what happens at the bottom, so that you know that there's a signal being sent by the data that something is in spec or it's not in spec and it's returned to where it should have been. And in fact, that part of the work is so exciting. We've been working and playing with that for about 15 years. I just recently put on a fellow who's got a PhD and 3 postdoctoral studies in data analysis, because that's the level of effort we're going to have to put into that. And I think if there's any EHOs thinking about they might want to do some further study, thinking about that digital approach to monitoring, surveillance in particular, rather than monitoring, and then how you can actually demonstrate compliance along a risk system, is going to be something that's really important. We've had exposure to SE and Vibrio as Nicola in recent times, and if there's some discussion afterwards, I'm happy to try and contribute, but I might stop there. I think that's my last slide, Sam. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity. I've enjoyed it. It was a bit stressful to try and throw the paper together, and a bit stressful when my computer died at 11:15 our time, but thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Jim. And yeah, we've struggled through the technical difficulties and a broad-ranging and extremely interesting presentation, so thank you. I think we've got a couple of questions on the chat, although I don't know that entirely fair to be asking yourself. One there about Campylobacter infection being caused by recreational water bodies, and that issue seems to be underrated. I don't know if you're able to comment on that.
We haven't, but we're doing some research with the One Health project here. And we're focused around some things that are actually more wildlife and the like, and what their contribution might be. So we're helping in that space. But I do think one of their streams is looking at that, Phil. I know the lead university is UQ, but there's a bunch of universities, as always, in those ones. So the One Health one in Australia, I'm pretty sure when I looked through and decided we would contribute, there was a stream there looking at water. But I've certainly heard some chatter, so I probably agree.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the opportunities for research when we do these presentations just pop up in every direction, that's for sure. There's another question there about poor water quality. You were referring to water quality and the use in the agricultural industry. Suggestion that low volumes of water allocations might have contributed to some of those problems?
Possibly could. It would depend on how people then try to use that water. We've had a couple we've looked at where people have had low water more because of drought and then had a sudden flood and they've used water that they shouldn't have used. Well, we could never prove that because they're never going to admit it. But so, yeah, I think that how people use water to try and maximize because if they're paying for it and it's getting more expensive because it's scarce, yeah, it's a very real observation. I think that's true. Whether it's been measured, certainly there's some water allocation discussions in Australia where water allocation is being reduced for agriculture, but I don't think it would necessarily be the only thing. It's more about how you identify your risks and then manage the risks. And I think that's where EHOs are often locally a lot better than other people. They recognise risks early and are very wise at understanding local applications or local interpretations of that risk and finding solutions. And I think that's something you shouldn't lose sight of. I think that's a really important aspect.
Yeah, and I suppose just on that subject, you mentioned water reuse and water reuse schemes. Any thoughts or comments on uniformity of standards for that type of thing?
There is an Australian standard and it's a heck of a telephone book. So that was one of the reasons why Western Australia did actually produce a more concise version for local governments to interpret, and we put a lot of effort into it. But there is a national standard. The big thing that I always go back to, though, is it needs to be fit for purpose and do a risk assessment in terms of what it's going to be used, because there are times when we required far more treatment of the water than where it was going to end up. And if you're thinking about climate change, if you're going to use a lot more treatment, you're using a heck of a lot more energy, especially for things like reverse osmosis. And does it really need to be cleaned to that level if it's going to be used, if there's going to be a treatment later on with that high level of treatment, why treat to that level if you're just using it for irrigation or something? But we've similarly seen situations where people have used water which really wasn't fit for the purpose. They didn't treat it or chlorinate it, and they used it as their last step before it went to market, and that's been an issue. So, yeah.
Thanks for that, Jim. Tanya, did you have any comments or questions?
Just to highlight, Nicola, our first speaker's just put a bit of an answer and further to Ursula's question in the chat box, that here in New Zealand there was a fairly recent case control study that didn't find swimming or recreational contact to be a significant factor. However, a new water survey or current work is finding Campylobacter in environmental water. So that's quite interesting. And Nicholas put the link in the chat box there for anyone who's interested to have a look at the study there as well.
Everyone's focused on pet and domestic pet animals, but we've been the work we're doing with the universities to look at what the reservoir in our possums in particular, which will make you New Zealanders happy, but our possums and some of those other animals that skate around in residential areas, it's more the ones that actually go in and out through our residential settings. So, yeah.
All right. Thanks, Sal. I don't think we've got any more questions there on the chat. So that brings us to the end of this webinar. It's our pleasure to bring these collaborative Trans-Tasman events with Environmental Health Australia and the New Zealand Institute of Environmental Health, and to celebrate Global Days of Significance. On behalf of Tanya and myself, I'd like to thank everyone who joined us today. And I'd also like to especially thank our fantastic speakers, Nicola and Jim, and wish you an enjoyable rest of your day. And we look forward to seeing you again for our next webinar series later in the year. So thanks very much, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Nicola. Thank you.